Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to debate these issues. His amendment is an interesting one, and certainly the broad principle of greater scrutiny of the FCA is one I would very much support. The amendment itself I don't feel is effective, so I couldn't support the amendment he has tabled, not least the issues I raised earlier. I think some of the issues in his amendment have already been addressed. The regulatory failures were clearly identified in the excellent Gloucester report, which was welcomed, I think, was the naming of individuals who failed with the FCA and who tried, obviously, to have their names redacted from that report and exempted from any specific criticism, which I think is one of the cultural issues with the FCA, is the lack of individual accountability, either in their own organisation or the organisations they regulate. Also, in his Amendment 5E, it talks about why they're only compensating 80% of the losses of individuals with non-capital finance. And I think that speaks to a very other broad principle, is many investments people make has to be subject to the principle of caveat emptor. It cannot be simply, especially with a relatively high-risk investment. I think it's incumbent on any investor to look at investment and judge the risk for themselves, as well as requiring some form of protection by the regulator. But the regulator can't be all things to all people, can't be all places at once. I did have a constituent came to me who'd lost a significant amount of money in London Capital and Finance in investments, and they were quite clear that they felt that they understood they were getting 8% return. If they're banks, they'd probably get 0.5% maximum in terms of interest. They realised that there was a risk involved in this kind of investment. It's quite obvious to most people that was the case, whether those people be sophisticated or unsophisticated investors. So I think that broad principle of an investor having to look at investment and judge themselves is very, very important.
Happy to give way.
It will be appalled at the regulator's performance here. Not just the number of complaints about LCF and the lack of joined-up thinking within the FCA. And this was some years down the line when this happened, after Andrew Bailey had taken over the FCA, and he knew there were problems right at the start. But the fact that there was no joining of the dots, and there was these clear allegations of inappropriate conduct within LCF. And the IFA, who actually drew attention to it, of course, a very competent person. It wasn't simply somebody who raised an issue saying, I don't like this company. This is an IFA, Neil Eversage, who wrote to the FCA, setting out exactly what was going wrong about the designation of unsophisticated investors as sophisticated, the encouragement to put themselves sophisticated, and where some of the investments were going. It was pretty clear what the problem was at LCF, and the FCA failed to act. It's simply unacceptable. So that's why I do welcome the compensation. My point was, it still has to be down to investors to make an educated decision, and certainly my constituent and others I've seen could see that this wasn't a government gilt you're investing in. There was obviously some risk attached.
And that's great.
I couldn't agree more, and the UK has a pretty poor record in terms of bringing forward for our prosecutions, and there's a number of things we need to do that aren't really within the scope of this bill, but not least, one of them, which the government is committed to, is bringing forward an offence of a failure to prevent an economic crime, which would make it far easier for the SFO to bring forward prosecutions. I'd welcome his joining of our campaign to bring that legislation forward, because I think it would make a huge difference to the SFO's ability to bring forward speedy prosecutions.
Will he give well?
That's very, very, very welcome. I mean, the key point, I think, about the amendment is about oversight. And I am concerned that the FCA isn't as accountable as it could be to this House. And the repatriation of a number of regulations and regulatory oversight of the FCA has now passed back to domestically, where before it lay with, there was accountability through the EU institutions. And so I am concerned that we have proper oversight of what the FCA does now going forward. And I think he's quite right, and the Honourable Member for Harrow is quite right. The jury's out still with the FCA. It might have made some bold claims that it's reforming and becoming more effective. And I welcome only, I think, a couple of weeks ago, it set out some clear targets for a reduction in the number of investors investing in high-risk investments and being subject to scams. Some specific criteria we can now hold them to account for. I'm just not clear how this House holds them to account. I can see how the Treasury holds them to account, but it's very important this House holds them to account, because in the work I've done on the all-party group, especially on fair business banking, we've seen a number of different cases that we've been dealing with where the FCA has not been proactive and not used the mechanisms at its disposal to sanction people who are responsible. That's simply unacceptable. It must be a much more proactive organisation, and I think to be held to account for that proactivity, there needs to be a clear line of responsibility between it and this House and members in this House. So I will conclude there if I can. To speak, I have a few more comments to make at third reading if I can, but on this amendment, a good attempt, but not one I can support.